Good evening. Welcome to the fourth and final Women's and Gender Studies program event in the College of Arts and Sciences Justice Theme Semester. I'm Dr. Carla Pfeffer, Director of Women's and Gender Studies. We thank the college for their generous support and are happy to be part of this important inaugural theme semester. Thanks also to the Division of Information Technology for providing tech support for these virtual events. Tonight we present The View from Somewhere, transgender journalist Lewis Raven Wallace on Objectivity and Justice. Mr. Wallace is an award-winning independent journalist based in Durham, North Carolina, and a co-founder of Press On, a Southern collective supporting journalism for liberation. His book and podcast, The View from Somewhere, focus on undoing the myth of objectivity in journalism and uplifting stories of marginalized journalists. He previously worked for Public Radio's Marketplace, WYSO, WBEZ, and Scalawag Magazine, and he is a 2020 Knight Visiting Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, a 2018 Heydrich Research Fellow at the University of Michigan, and a 2015 Air New Voices Fellow. I'm now going to turn it over to Lewis so that he can tell you more about his work and his new book. After his presentation, we'll have time for Q&A, so do feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A tool. Lewis, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me, Carla, and it's great to see, not see everyone. I'm sorry that we can't all be actually physically together, but I'm glad we're doing safety first with this. So I'm Lewis, my pronouns are he, ze, or they, and I'm reaching you all from Durham, North Carolina, Eno and Occaneechi territory originally. And saying hi to my family down in Columbia, South Carolina. And I will talk a lot more in a little bit about kind of the contents and the argument of my book, The View from Somewhere, and my podcast by the same name. But I'm going to start out first by just doing a little bit of story sharing about myself and how I came to journalism. So if we could come out of the slide presentation, and then we'll go back to that in a couple minutes. So I grew up in Michigan, and a lot of the sort of formation of my ideas about storytelling and about journalism actually came out of being part of queer youth activist movements in the late 90s and early 2000s. And I came out as gay or queer, I think the same year as Ellen DeGeneres. And came out as transgender the same year that a kind of iconic movie called Boys Don't Cry came out. That was really the first Hollywood representation of a transmasculine person, and a very disturbing and controversial film. It's based on a true story, and the young man, Brandon Teena, gets murdered. And so those are just examples that I give to kind of illustrate the types of representations of queer life and trans life that I might have seen as I was coming up. And I was very much formed in this kind of growing queer youth movement of the 90s, where we were very, very focused on the importance of telling our own stories and shaping the narrative and putting ideas out there based on our own personal experiences, particularly for trans youth. There was so little representation of anything like a non-binary identity. That terminology didn't really exist. And we talked about being genderqueer, and that was a word that I learned through meeting people, and I didn't see it, in the media for years and years until after I learned it. And we made zines and we mailed them back and forth, and the way that we connected with one another, but also the way that we represented ourselves was really dependent on being storytellers and, in a sense, sort of doing our own journalism to combat the fake news about us, right? All the misrepresentations of trans people, lack of representation, but also often misrepresentation. We were represented as, mentally ill or as confused, young people. Even in the case of Brandon Teena, he had been represented originally as when his death was covered by the Village Voice. And so I was an activist for many, many years before I came into the field of journalism. And I came in the field of journalism through a really wonderful fellowship at WBEZ in Chicago that was for people who did community organizing work in the city. And at the time I was living in Chicago on the far north side and working with queer and trans youth and youth of color to do a storytelling project about youth encounters with police in order to encourage conversations about alternatives to calling police on the youth. And so very much an early sort of alternatives to policing, defund the police abolitionist effort there in Chicago, led by someone named Miriam Kaba. And in the process of doing that work, I kind of reconnected with these roots of storytelling and came into the idea of recording those stories, right, and putting them on the radio or finding an audience, and walked into WBEZ, the big radio station in Chicago, in the fall of 2012. And my very first day there, I saw, radio hosts going live and shows being put together, and there's a director looking through the glass and hitting buttons and pointing at people, and reporters are running in and out of recording studios and putting stuff live on the air. And I was so just thrilled by that I decided that day, I want to be a reporter. I had never imagined myself in that role because I thought of the news media as this kind of outside entity, mainstream media that just doesn't cover my community well, and that we can't trust them to talk about what the work that we're doing and how we identify. And then all of a sudden I found myself in mainstream media and was trained up really quickly and became a reporter, first for WBEZ and then for a small station in Ohio, another public radio station called YSO, and then for Marketplace, which is a national business show. And we can go back in now to the slide presentation, to slide number 4, I think it is. And so years passed. I worked in public radio for about 5 years. I covered the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2016, I covered the primary race, and in particular had the somewhat jarring experience of covering a rally for Donald Trump in Southwest Ohio, where I was living and working at the time, in early 16 during the primary. So this was before he'd become the candidate. And through those experiences of both covering Black Lives Matter and covering Trump, I began to see these kind of gaps in the ethos of journalism as it had been taught to me when I came into public media. And there was very much this idea that journalists should be quote unquote objective, and that we should stand outside of the story, and that we should recuse ourselves from anything in which we had a personal stake. And so if I was friends with the Black Lives Matter activists, for example, I wasn't supposed to cover them. If I was out there doing advocacy as a trans person, well, I couldn't really do that, actually. That was really against the ethics policies of the place where I worked, to do sort of public advocacy work at the same time at all, even if I recused myself from the stories. And then a big issue that arose during the primary election was this question of bias, neutrality, objectivity, as they were presented in our coverage of Trump. And the big question that people were asking then, that unfortunately some people are still asking now, was, do we use words like racism or racist or lies or liar to talk about what it is that Trump is saying and what he's doing? And we can have one discussion about the persuasiveness of calling something racism versus describing its impact and so on. But this was not a discussion about persuasiveness. This was a discussion about our credibility as journalists, being perceived to be at risk if we seemed to be not neutral on Donald Trump, at a certain point, almost no matter what he said or did. So you'll hear, and you would hear especially at that time on public radio stations, the reporters doing these kind of dances where they would say, a statement that could not be verified to mean lie, right? And we reporters pride ourselves on being concise But in this case, it was quite the opposite, right? Sort of running circles around what it is that we're actually trying to say when someone has lied and we're saying, oh, someone has said a fact that cannot be verified. So next slide. In my growing kind of frustration with the non-biased and quote unquote objective ethos of public media, right around the inauguration of Donald Trump in early 2017. At this point, I was working for Marketplace in New York City. And so I had moved from Ohio and was doing national daily reporting for the most part. And I began to really question whether we could continue under the Trump administration to do our jobs in public media and in public service in the way that we'd been doing them before. And I wrote this blog post on my Medium blog called Objectivity is Dead and I'm Okay with It. And you see just the beginning of it here. I talk about losing sleep and kind of questioning, you know, what are we doing to adapt to this government that believes in alternative facts? And that phraseology of alternative facts had just come out a week before when Kellyanne Conway said it directly after the inauguration on TV. Next slide. And so this blog post had 5 basic points to it. The first one was that neutrality isn't real, that nobody is neutral, nor should we pretend that we are. And the framework for that, for me, of course, is being a transgender person and a white person. It's very clear to me what my stake is in trans issues and therefore in gender issues in general, right? So I've never really been neutral or seen as neutral by other people about gender issues because I've been part of this tiny minority, very marginalized population since I was a teenager and came out. And so I've never been neutral and I can't be on my own humanity, but I also believe really firmly that no one should be neutral on my humanity and that in fact to claim neutrality is to stand on the sidelines and let people like me die and suffer. And I see the same kind of divide when it comes to race and racism that, you know, as a white person, the assumption is that I would be able to be objective on race, right? But whiteness and white privilege itself is a form of bias and something that I think all of us have a stake in. So neutrality isn't real. Next slide. And it follows from everything I just said that it matters a lot who's making editorial decisions. So this is the basic kind of newsroom diversity question of, you know, not only can we not, no one can be objective, but also we can't even be sort of fair and representative and, you know, other terms that we might use to mean trustworthy if we have all white people or mostly white people or all men or mostly men or all cisgender people making editorial decisions, which is very, very common. And so it matters, the diversification of newsrooms and in particular of leadership matters a lot, and I think was one of the driving forces behind the many failures of accurate and comprehensive news coverage in the run-up to Donald Trump's election and over the last few years. And I think particularly the ways in which the press has missed the story about race and racism and white supremacy has had a lot to do with so many newsrooms being white dominated. Next slide. We can and should still tell the truth and check our facts. So all of this is not me throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying, you know, forget about it. Let's just all write opinion pieces all day long. There are facts out there in the world. They're verifiable by multiple sources. That's what journalism in part is. It's also storytelling. It's also community building. It's also framing. And that's a really important part of this kind of critique of objectivity is how we frame. But it's still true that we're out there to report, to learn and report about ideally verifiable facts and stories. Next slide. Journalists should fight back was the 4th point. And so this was really observing the Trump administration's attacks during the election cycle, and then right out of the gate when he became president, on the press, and seeing that not only can we not be neutral on our own humanity based on identity or whatever form of power that may be, but that we also can't and shouldn't be neutral on our role as journalists, that in repressive societies, journalists are often part of a resistance, and seeing that in the United States, journalists who hadn't maybe previously identified that way would need to become part of a resistance and become more comfortable with sort of openly saying, you know what, we're going to defend democracy and the truth over power structures as they exist. Next slide. And then that led to this conclusion that, you know, we need to define our values and get clear on our sense of purpose as journalists. And my audience for writing all this in my mind was mostly public radio journalists who have a broad and general sense of working in the public service, right? But often don't have a clear definition of sort of who is our public, and really sticky questions that we face now as journalists about what do we do with a public that is, with parts of the public that are advocating white supremacist views, right? Or that are advocating violent or transphobic views, or that are advocating, in a sense, for the end of democratic practices that then makes what we do as journalists obsolete. And so we need to ask these hard questions about what our values are. So I wrote all of that in a blog post. So exciting, right? Blog post, thrilling. And I probably had 50 followers on my Medium blog at the time, something like that. And, you know, people weren't like, everybody wasn't sharing this thing around and clicking on it and whatever. It was just me over there kind of blabbering and then going back to work at Marketplace. But the same day that I shared this blog post, I got a call from my manager, actually from her manager at work, and learned that because I had posted this criticism of objectivity, that I was going to be suspended from my job and taken off the air until I took it down, because they felt that it misrepresented Marketplace, and that it compromised our impartiality, and in particular that I had used the words white supremacy. I said Donald Trump benefits from white supremacy, and then it might be perceived as partisan. And I went through a whole sort of miserable process that some of my family who are here right now know about and remember, of deciding to take this post down because I didn't want to lose my beautiful dream job in New York working for national radio, and then deciding that in this moment of what I viewed as a true threat to democracy and a potential rise of totalitarianism, that I wanted to keep the blog post up. And so I put the post back up and explained that choice to my employer and got fired from that job. And next slide. And for just a little moment, because it was right after the election and there was so much anxiety among journalists, there was this kind of explosion of attention to my story and interest in and debate about it in public media. And that attention got me interested in, you know, how did we get here? And I had been interested in that, but in this moment, people were asking me, it was like I was an overnight expert on the critique of objectivity because I wrote this one blog post, right? And I'm thinking, I really don't know that much about this, but I would like to. And so I ended up writing a book, The View from Somewhere, and making that my main project over the following year and a half, looking for both information about the roots of supposedly objective journalism and why are we hanging on so hard to this framework as journalists in the US in particular, and then also looking for people who had done journalism outside of that framework and who had been activist journalists or been journalists who critiqued or pushed back on objectivity and maybe hadn't been recognized in a more mainstream journalistic canon, or whose stories weren't being taught in journalism schools and so on. And so I knew that they must be there because I knew even from my own political upbringing, as I talked about, that trans people, for example, queer activists had always had this analysis of, objectivity isn't real, and we need to tell our own stories. And so that is what my book is about. So I'll run through, if we can go to the next slide, a little bit of the history. First I'm going to pause on this quote, because this came out of an interview that I did really early on in the reporting process for the book with someone named Ramona Martinez, who had also left public media, who kind of summarized the argument that I ended up making really, really well when she said that objectivity is the ideology of the status quo. So this idea that we can stand outside of ideology ever is false. And then it follows that what's considered objective is actually just what appears to be sort of acceptable to the mainstream or acceptable to the status quo. And I saw from working within journalism the way that mindset is repeatedly reinforced over and over by journalists sort of trying not to step outside of the status quo. A good example of that is two-party system, partisanship. Journalists talk about how people are divided and we have this growing partisanship, and then people read about people are divided and we have this growing partisanship and feel like they need to pick a side, and then journalists write about how people are divided and we have this growing partisanship, and that becomes this cycle that reinforces that status quo that's been sort of co-established by people and journalists. And journalists don't stand outside of that. And I think a good way for journalism to oppose growing partisanship would be to actually cover the diversity of viewpoints and experiences that fall outside of that, right? And not be as focused on the back and forth in the two-party system. But so long as journalists continue this practice of covering political horse races, it reinforces it as a status quo. And so it's and yet it appears to be objective, or it appears to be the fair and balanced way to tell the story. Next slide. So just a little bit of history behind all this. Early on, in the earliest days of what we think of as journalism in the United States, there was no concept at all of a neutral newspaper, an objective newspaper, or even a sort of politically center newspaper. Papers were generally funded by political parties, or they were funded by particular industries who wanted to get out information about trade. Next slide. And so it was in the 1830s and the 1840s that this idea of the penny paper was born, and that was a paper that was funded by people buying it, right, for cheap on the street. And that was a new thing. And then the other way that type of newspaper was funded was by selling advertising. And the owners, the publishers of those papers, in turn, had an interest in appearing to not side with one political party, because they wanted to sell papers to everybody, and they wanted to be able to tell their advertisers that they could sell papers to any, person on the street, and it would be just a penny, and then they get all this money from the ads, which is more or less still the business model of newspapers in particular in this country. It hasn't been working well for them for quite a while, but that business model itself is what led to the earliest kind of ethos of a neutral or nonpartisan reporting approach. Next slide. And of course, there were always, throughout the 1800s, publications that didn't participate in that appearance of nonpartisanship at all. Abolitionist papers, Black papers, suffragist papers, all kinds of things. And you even have really famous figures like Joseph Pulitzer and Horace Greeley writing big splashy opinion pieces right on the front page of their own papers that they owned. And so the idea that we have of objectivity now really didn't come into play until quite a bit later. Next slide. And even back then, there was some really interesting debate about neutrality in the exact way that I was talking about it a few minutes ago versus nonpartisanship. So a publisher named T. Thomas Fortune, who published a Black paper called the New York Age, made this, I think, really beautiful and useful distinction about, that he would never be neutral on the humanity of Black people, right? But that he also didn't trust political parties, and so he could be nonpartisan. He wasn't going to side with a party. And I really like that distinction. It's something that I've adopted into sort of my own journalistic ethos today. But it's a subtlety that gets sort of washed over, right, by this idea that journalists should never appear to be biased on anything, that you can be, pro-Black, or you can be anti-racist, for example, without being partisan or being associated with a political party, and that we need to sort of disambiguate those things. Next slide. And I can't, of course, tell this story about non-neutral journalists in history without talking about Ida B. Wells, Ida B. Wells Barnett, who founded and ran, or actually, sorry, she didn't found, but she bought and ran the Memphis Free Press when she was very young. She was in her mid-20s, and she was a Black woman who had been born actually into slavery, as was T. Thomas Fortune. And she began to cover the stories of lynchings in the 1890s because a friend of hers in Memphis was actually lynched. And 3 men were lynched that day, and one of them was someone that she was close with. And she saw up close and personal that the story that was told in the white paper about their lynching criminalized them, turned them into people who had done something wrong, and said that the white mob had lynched them in self-defense. And of course, lynchings were never about self-defense. They were a form of racial terror. But at the time, no one was reporting that narrative, not Black papers, not white papers, nobody. It was just sort of assumed that they were these incidents involving some level of criminality. And then she saw, well, my friend wasn't a criminal, and he was targeted and killed, and he owned a grocery store that was a competitor with the white grocery store, and the men from the white grocery store had led the call to lynch him. And she was like, if that's happening here, that there must be stories like this from all over. Lynching or the way the lynching story has been told is fake news, right? So I need to go uncover that. And she wrote about these lynchings in her paper, which was actually burned to the ground by a white mob. And then she went on to travel all over the country and report out locally the stories of lynchings, looking for the truth behind what had often been a repeated lie that criminalized the person who had been lynched. And she became one of the first kind of investigative data reporters in the country by collecting data about lynching from newspapers and personal accounts and compiling it. And it's in many cases still the data that's called on when we try to understand this violent history in the past. So she's really an iconic activist journalist who was smeared in publications like the New York Times for her public stance on lynching and for the ways in which she stood up for Black people. Next slide. And she was really around before journalism even became professionalized and objective. It took a long time. The first journalism schools were founded in the early 1900s, and ethics codes and policies of the kind that we have now that dictate objectivity started to come into place then. Next slide. And so we saw those guides published in the 10s and 20s. We can go to the next one. And then alongside that sort of professionalization of journalism, other fields were beginning to use this concept of objectivity as a methodology, right, for scientific research. And journalists decided that the best way to sort of try to fight back against propaganda and build credibility would be to adopt this same kind of approach, right? And it was initially adopted as a methodology, a way to approach reporting using scientific methods verification and double checking and things that are broadly are good, right? But also end up entailing a set of assumptions that says there is one objective way to view a story, or there is an objective way to view a story, that requires us to be neutral and situate ourselves outside of the story looking in. Next slide. And just as soon as we had these codes for objectivity and journalism was weaponized against marginalized people. That for the first people actually were labor organizers. Journalists who were organizing unions started to get fired for supposedly being biased or being unobjective. And those are the first examples I was able to find of those kinds of firings. And then of course you had folks like Ida B. Wells or T. Thomas Fortune. This was a little later than that, but Black journalists like Marvell Cook, Indigenous reporters, Latinx reporters, activists for women's rights being smeared as non-objective as a way to keep them out of newsrooms. And that tradition unfortunately goes on to today in mainstream journalism, and is a big piece of what especially reporters of color have pointed out many times over the years, continues to create this obstacle to truly representative newsrooms, not because people of color or trans people can't be objective and people from more recognized mainstream identities or power positions can be objective. That's not the problem. The problem is that we're not seen as objective, and that is used as an excuse to minimize our voices. And it's happened over and over again in many, many stories that I've heard, especially after I got fired. Lots of people got in touch with me and said, you know, this, in one version or another, this happened to me, and I left journalism because my credibility was always being questioned because of my identity and because I stood up for my community. Next slide. And that problem, of course, goes hand in hand with an unfortunate legacy of racism in mainstream media. So blocking people of color from participating in the production of news stories has played out in many ways, with objectivity as kind of one of the tools. In 1968, the Kerner Commission report, which was responding to the racial uprisings, sometimes called the race riots of that year, really highlighted the role of media in upholding a white perspective and a white bias, and connected the uprisings to that failure on the part of white-run media to highlight the real conditions in Black communities. And over the last couple of years, a lot of people have talked about, you know, what hasn't changed, unfortunately, in mainstream media in the 50 years since. Journalists of color also have been, as Ida B. Wells was, targeted directly by violence, either by state violence or by lack of protection from the state, in the case of her newspaper being burned to the ground. Ruben Salazar was an activist journalist in the Latino community in Los Angeles who was killed by police in 1970 and became kind of a movement martyr. But one example among many of journalists of color who have had to sort of go out on their own in order to stand up for their community, and then have been targeted really explicitly by violence. He was a really amazing writer and journalist who also had a critique of objectivity, and his death at the hands of police remains, I don't know if unsolved is the word, because it's actually known what happened, but no one has faced any consequences for his death. And then over the years, we see this interesting kind of twisting of the framework of objectivity that was really adopted by both liberals and conservatives in the early days, which was that right-wing media activists in the 60s and 70s and 80s began to see that objectivity would be a really good sort of wedge for them to use to gain a platform in the mainstream. And so they started a number of big national organizations that would go after public media and go after newspapers and say that any perspective or story that they didn't like was liberal media bias, and that the answer to that liberal media bias was to bring in more right-wing activist, far right-wing activist voices. And so, you know, in the 80s, as we started to see sometimes stories in the mainstream about gay people, or in the 70s, there were a lot more stories about communities of color, and stories bringing in different perspectives on international issues as well, and on Latin America. And all of those kinds of reporting became targets for right-wing media activists who painted that as liberal media bias, painted oppressed people's viewpoints as liberal media bias that needed to be balanced by conservative ideology and by bringing more far-right conservatives onto the airwaves or into the papers. And that was part of a whole kind of broad conservative strategy to make fringe conservative views appear as if they are mainstream conservative views that right now today we're seeing the far-reaching consequences of, but it's a strategy that really started in the 70s, in the early 70s. And then liberal media has responded instead of by saying, you know, no, we're not going to give a platform to Pat Buchanan. That's a good example of a just extreme homophobe and racist who was given platforms on lots of different mainstream media outlets in the 80s and 90s. But instead of saying, no, we're not going to give a platform to these people, liberal media has sort of shifted toward this right-wing argument and said, okay, fair enough. You know, if we're going to talk about the quote unquote liberal viewpoint of gay people or what have you, we're also going to give a platform to Pat Buchanan. But of course, being gay is a lived experience. Opposing gay people is an opinion that you decided to have, and it's a total false equivalence that's been fed into over and over again by purportedly more mainstream media in an attempt to appear balanced. Next slide. I'm actually going to skip this one and keep moving. So the framework that I work in now, as I have moved through the process of writing this book and creating this podcast and telling all these stories about activist journalists and movement journalists, is that not only is there no neutrality or no objectivity, but we're either working to uphold oppression or we're working to dismantle it. And journalism can do both of those things. And sometimes it can do both of those things at the same time. It's not unambiguous, but it's never neutral. And so our journalism can be protecting the status quo, or it can be helping us fight for justice and imagine new worlds. And for me, coming to that and leaving public media and creating this podcast and telling these stories and talking to more and more self-identified, movement journalists who are trying to build movement and make change through their work has been kind of a coming full circle for myself personally to those early days of telling stories about being a trans teenager in the Midwest, and knowing that those stories mattered beyond just personal representation, but mattered in a political way because they help us to imagine new worlds, and they are also true stories. And so I think that's at its most kind of elemental what journalism can be, beyond and outside of objectivity. Next slide. And we'll actually go on to the next one. I like to share these beautiful images created by my good friend Billy D of lots of inspiring journalists, but we don't have time to talk about all of them. So the final thing I want to share with you, because people always ask about this, is, well, if not objectivity, then what? What values are we bringing to bear? And I work now for an organization that I co-founded called Press On. That's a Southern movement journalism collective. And we're in the process of creating an ethics code for movement journalism that's kind of a proactive, anti-racist, anti-oppressive approach to journalism. And we're very keen on collectivism as a way of developing ideas. And so these possible values for post-objective journalism are just like Lewis things, my things that I brainstormed that are kind of my working values for my own journalism right now, knowing that movement journalism and journalism beyond objectivity does build on a long tradition, right, that goes back to Ida B. Wells, and that really values collectivism and centers the experiences of people of color. And so a working model for post-objective journalism could look like this, and I'll just leave that for a minute for folks to take in rather than running them through one by one. Next slide. And let's go to the next slide. This is just the thought that I want to leave you all with. People often ask me if, you know, does no more objectivity mean no more facts? And the answer is no. And I really do think that we need to retire the concept of an objective viewpoint or even an inherently objective methodology or way of telling a story, right? We can seek facts, we can seek truth, we can tell stories, but they are going to sometimes contradict each other because framing and perspective and culture matter. And that doesn't mean that they're not worth fighting for. And one of the beautiful things about the internet and about this environment of sort of overstimulation that we're living in now is that a lot more people have a platform to speak their truth. It also means that there's a lot more to sort through, right? But I don't think that gatekeeping and sort of limiting who can tell their stories is the solution to that problem that leads to more justice. I think the solution actually comes kind of from the ground up and from communities fighting for and representing our stories and our truths and our lived realities. Next slide. So please buy my book and listen to my podcast. You can find all that on viewfromsomewhere.com. That's the podcast landing site. And I can also post a direct link to the book with a discount code for folks here tonight. It's a 20% discount if you want to go ahead and just buy the book from the publisher tonight. I'll post that in just a minute. And that's my Twitter handle there, @LewisPants. Next slide. We can skip this one and I think go right to questions.
Thank you so much, Lewis, for this wonderful talk. I want to make sure that folks know where to find that Q&A tool. It is the little icon that looks like chat boxes with a question mark on it. So if you click on that, you can go ahead and start asking your questions. I'm going to go ahead and start with one of the first questions that we received. One of the first questions is kind of thinking about, let me go here for just a second. Here we go. There have been further efforts on social media, on Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok, for example, to suppress what people can say about Donald Trump. What's your take on this continued silencing?
I think it is an unsurprising outcome, and I guess outcome isn't the right word because we're still in the middle of this, right? And there's a lot of directions that it can go, but it's an unsurprising byproduct of, you know, sort of the whole environment of rising repression that led me to write my blog post, write my book, and all of that, and then the consolidation of social media communications under a few big, powerful companies. And so, you know, I'm very pro technology, right? But the uses of that technology desperately need to be democratized and collectivized. And to me, sort of the irony with social media platforms and a lot of the technology behind them is that they would work great for that. You know, they're really set up so that lots of people can give feedback and participate, right? But they are not collective tools of democratic leadership or communication. They're companies. And so they're doing what's good for their bottom line at the end of the day. And I don't mean that in a sort of conspiracy theory way, but just in a realistic way, that I think they're making calculations about what they decide is biased and what they decide community standards are and so on, that do not have to do with what leads to a healthy and safe society for everyone.
Thank you for that. The next question is, being fired for a blog post based on truth is a really traumatic event. Did writing your book help you work through everything that happened?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, it really did. There's something immensely healing about learning this history. And a really good example of that is that I met someone who had been targeted in a very similar way in the late 1980s. She was out as gay and openly socialist as well, and a gay activist. And she worked at a newspaper where she was in a union, and they had a contract that protected her off work activities. And so she was allowed to be a socialist activist on her off time and then come in and work for the newspaper in Tacoma, Washington. And the paper got bought out by a big conglomerate, McClatchy, and they busted up the union. And under the new contract, the workers didn't have those protections. And then her boss came after her for participating in, ironically, activism for worker protections for LGBT workers. And she stayed at the paper. She didn't get fired. She stayed at the paper, and they moved her off of reporting and onto the copy desk, and she sued them, and she fought this legal battle against McClatchy and the Tacoma News Tribune for 7 years while still working at the paper. And it went to the Oregon State Supreme Court, or Washington, sorry, State Supreme Court, and she didn't win, unfortunately, her legal case, but just this completely awesome woman whose story, I think, tells us a lot about the relationship between unions and worker power and the framework of objectivity and how it's deployed against people. And she was still there telling her story, and she was like, I'm so glad someone else has picked up this torch, right? And we ended up having a really strong and kind of beautiful connection. And that's just one example of that, of for me, why the reporting process was also a healing process, because I got to meet people like her name is Sandy Nelson, and other people from around the country who are, you know, still doing this work in various ways. A lot of other people who had been pushed out of journalism or decided never to go into journalism, who have experienced the stories on the podcast or the book as something that's affirming or healing for them. And so, you know, connecting with history, connecting with kind of movement ancestors and activist ancestors, and connecting with other people who are activated right now, I think is kind of, to me, the best balm for someone in a power position doing some stupid shit to you, because there's nothing you could do about that person, you know, but it's not ultimately about them. Like, social justice movements are all about collective action and sticking together. And that's been very much my experience of the last few years, is like people standing up for me standing up for other people, and that building on itself into like a really meaningful existence. So.
Thank you. Would you extend your idea that neutrality is not possible in journalism to neutrality also not being possible for judges? If so, how might this double subjectivity of the journalist and the judge affect reporting on legal proceedings?
That's a great question, and I had noticed as I was reporting out the book quite a bit of interesting overlap between the framing of objectivity in the legal system and the framing of objectivity in journalism, maybe largely in that they're two of the fields where people are kind of holding on the hardest to that frame. You know, I know that in fields like, well, certainly women's and gender studies, but you know, even anthropology or history, some of these critiques have gotten a lot further, right, and had more influence on the structure. But there's something very threatening to the sort of the whole legal structure about not having a concept anymore of an objective judge. So I do think that there's a strong parallel there, and some of the best criticism of journalistic objectivity that I read was actually by a legal scholar named Anne Scales, talking about the sort of problems for feminism in supposedly objective legal frames, and in particular the problems for telling the true stories, first-person stories of women who had been assaulted or sexually harassed, and those stories being believed. And so, big picture, long term, I think in some ways the abolition of objectivity as the status quo ideology in both law and journalism requires rebuilding of our social values, right? And a recreation of our very fundamental ideas about truth and collectivity, and even things like harm and healing. And so, you know, if we can't have an objective judge, maybe what we have is not a judge at all, right, as the arbiter of harm and conflict in community. And it opens up a whole other set of questions that I think is less to me about how journalists might cover judges, but how both the role of the journalist and the role of the judge are really fundamentally different in a society with more just and less hierarchical structures and ideologies and values. And that sort of liberationist vision is what I'm pushing for in the long term.
Thank you. Our next attendee wants to know, I'm curious how much your argument about objectivity is informed by the work of feminist scholars like Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, and Dorothy Smith, who have long critiqued claims about scientific objectivity.
Thanks, that's a great question. So I would say not explicitly informed, but that's really just probably my ignorance, right? Like I came into queer and trans activism and learned a lot about media criticism in this kind of grassroots zine culture kind of way that actually was really heavily influenced by feminist scholarship, and was in conversation with feminist scholarship in a way that I didn't know at the time. I wasn't familiar with, and then spent many years in activist communities, and then was in journalism. And so my research into the argument within journalism has mostly looked at journalists, you know, and a little bit, as I just mentioned, at scholarship in the legal field, actually. But I didn't do a lot of kind of cross-disciplinary reading on critiques of objectivity in other disciplines, though I was aware that they were there and had been there, and had, as I said a minute ago, probably gotten a little bit further in in fields other than journalism than the critiques of objectivity have in journalism.
Okay. Did the Tom Cotton editorial imbroglio at the New York Times advance the cause of moving beyond the standard of objectivity in journalism, in your opinion, or did it only further muddy the waters?
Well, I think from my view, it advanced the cause because it was such a blatant example of how papers, even if it's on their editorial page, make meaningful and consequential choices about what they choose to give a platform to and what they don't. And I think it was to me, a pretty egregious example of that on the part of the New York Times publishing that, I think was very irresponsible. But the reason that I think it made a difference is that so many people spoke up about it, that there was such widespread outrage. And I think in particular that journalists of color at the New York Times were vocal, was a huge and in many ways new step. Not that journalists of color at the New York Times had never been vocal before, but on the tip of collective action and collective power, more and more journalists over the last few years have been seeing that when we come together, we can make an argument for an anti-racist ethos in newsrooms more effectively than we can when we work alone, because what ends up is you have the most vulnerable people being vocal and then getting pushed out, and young journalists of color, interns, entry-level people like me at Marketplace or whatever, end up not lasting in those work environments unless more people are willing to speak up collectively. And a lot of people spoke out about that Tom Cotton editorial and just said, this is too far. So, I hate that it takes that, but it takes that sometimes. It takes going too far in a really hot political moment for people to say, we have had enough and we're going to do something collectively, which is, I think, really does advance the cause in ways that we maybe can't see now.
Thanks. So this is our final question for the evening. What do you think would be the alternative to the corporate model of the social media companies we have now? What's another way to do social media that isn't controlled by corporations?
Oh, I love that question. I feel it's a bit outside of my lane. I mean, I would just be sort of dreaming it up right now, but let's dream that up together. I can make a recommendation on that tip, which is the first season of this really great podcast called Zigzag is all about blockchain and blockchain technology. And it's not quite the same thing as social media, but it's an underlying technology that can be used for a lot of different kinds of information infrastructure that doesn't inherently require a centralized structure or a single owner. And these two journalists in the podcast Zigzag go really deep on what is blockchain and what is its potential for democratizing journalism. But I would really recommend that if you're interested in the technology piece, and in a longer conversation, we could get into blockchain and what our beautiful vision is for the people's Twitter powered by blockchain.
That's going to be the topic of the next book, right?
Yeah, I guess we'll see.
Well, I want to thank you so much, Lewis, for joining us tonight. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for this final event in the Women's and Gender Studies and College of Arts and Sciences collaboration for the Justice Theme Semester. It's our last collaboration, but there are lots more Justice Theme Semester events out there. So do check them out, and do be sure to buy Lewis's book, which is fantastic. Again, thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the wonderful questions.